the story of our race is we're lawbreakers. I mean, that's that. So it is a little odd when somebody looks at natural law, it sort of concludes that the race is pretty lawful. The whole lot of us are quite unlawful.
Happy New Year, listeners of Mid-America Reformed Seminary's Roundtable Podcast. I'm Jared Luchabor, Manager of Marketing here, presenting to you episode 14 and part 2 of our natural law conversation. I hope you had a wonderful Christmas holiday. I sure did in both Michigan and the Great White North. Yes, I am from Canada, full disclosure. And I also hope you ushered in the new year surrounded by great friends and family. Well, on to the podcast. Part 1 of Natural Law introduced the subject matter, but now we want to understand a little bit more about it, particularly how it functions in society. I'm just going to leave that there and let our faculty unpack that for you. Once more at the table in speaking order are Dr. Alan Strange, Dr. J. Mark Beach, and Reverend Andrew Compton.
Yeah, Dr. Beach, I think, was saying at our last time together that, yes, in fact, due to the fall, due to our sin, there's that twisting and perverting of the natural law. So there's the whole question of, yes, there's the natural law. And yes, we can see it operative in places where there's not direct divine revelation and people still manifest something. But what do they really manifest? And one of the things that I think we want to say is some conversations about the natural law seem to give fallen, unregenerate man a lot more credit in this regard than is due. Paul, in Romans 2, is not saying that fallen, unregenerate man follows the natural law, simpliciter. Paul is saying he's looking at a sinful world that is not yet what it should be in the sense of it's not completely given over to sin. The real consequences of the fall are hell, just total given over to sin. And so how do we look at a world in which we do see some order and some law? Well, how does it exist in a fallen, sinful world? It exists because of natural law. But then we need to hasten to add, I think, what Dr. Beach was saying. What is the real use of it? How much is suppressed? How much is really twisted and perverted? And then also even to recognize that the law itself in a general way, if you want to come back on the other side, Christians themselves are not exactly the most noteworthy law keepers. We ourselves break the law a lot. I mean,
and that's having the written, specially revealed Ten Commandments.
And this is why Jesus came both to uphold the law in his active obedience, which I ardently affirm, and in his passive obedience. Right, but really, I mean, the story of our race is we're lawbreakers. I mean, that's that. So it is a little odd when somebody looks at natural law, it sort of concludes that the race is pretty lawful. The whole lot of us are quite unlawful, but there's a certain sense in which maybe the common grace aspect of that, we're not as absolutely depraved. We're totally depraved. We're not absolutely the culture. You can see it, but
well, the law itself doesn't enable our obedience to it. I don't remember who first said it, but I like stealing it because I like the illustration. But the law can be likened to a lifeguard at the municipal swimming pool sitting there on her perch as a lifeguard, but she happens to be chained to her post. So what can she do? Can she save anybody? No, she can chirp her whistle, stop running, no dunking, no diving, quit the horseplay. She can bark and yell orders, but can she enable people to behave and do well? Can she actually jump out of her perch since she's locked into it and save anybody? No. The law as law doesn't ennoble people so that now suddenly, because I know the law, I do the law. This gets back to when we're dealing with law and natural law, and the same is true of natural law. What does it do for you? Where can you go with it? Calvin was pretty potent in arguing that it leaves people without excuse. It shows some semblance of an ordering of society, but is it sufficient? And there's a key question. Mm-hmm. Is it sufficient in itself to order a society? And particularly when you face that question, you're facing a question that within Calvin's context, you had a cultural setting that was permeated with special revelation, with worship services, church services, a Christendom, no matter all of its compromises, it still forms something of the ethos, the cultural ethos. So, in other words, you had something of a spillover of the blessings of special revelation in various ways, such that if you talked about natural law in that context, it was more readily understood and apprehended precisely because of special revelation that also permeated society to varying degrees. Now, you take that and you lift it out of that setting, put it in a modern secularist humanist setting, and say, now natural law, do for us what we need done. Give us just laws for society. Well, most atheistic people do not accept an appeal to natural law. They want to know, what do you mean by that? And who gave it to us? And where are you getting that from? And as soon as you say lawgiver, a theistic lawgiver, the Christian God, well, now you've introduced special revelation into the program. It's in view. And so an appeal to natural law isn't some innocent appeal within our cultural setting. It's a very disputed question, even among ethicists and Christian ethicists.
And you know what's interesting in this, and you mentioned a society either permeated by Christian sensibilities or one lacking such, to show you how in almost any situation you can make something of a wax nose of natural law. In other words, it depends on who's defining it. Go back into the 19th century, you see the slavery crisis was addressed in part by the General Assembly of 1818 of the PCUSA, spoke about the wrongness of slavery. They condemned it without any qualification, a very strong statement of the 1818 General Assembly, both in terms of scripture and express revelation and natural revelation, or general revelation, or natural law. But when people say, okay, there's a good example, pretty much everybody today, thankfully, agrees that slavery is wrong. Mm-hmm. And I heard somebody arguing just the other day, well, there's a good example of the right use of natural law. We can argue slavery's wrong. Well, I just have to say this. A few decades later, after 1818, in the 1840s, the infamous proponent of this, perhaps one of the chief ever in the United States, was John C. Calhoun of South Carolina. And John C. Calhoun argued not only that slavery was not just a necessary evil, that's what it had been first said to be, and then it was said to be morally neutral. He argued that it was a positive good. That was the first time that argument was made in that way. And he defended it, and he argued it vehemently as a positive good on the basis of natural law. Now, you have to understand, he obviously, his understanding of this was racist. It was all sorts of things. But the point is you had that was a fairly Christian society, mid-19th century America. And here you had one of the leading constitutional experts arguing for slavery on the basis of natural law. So the point is, you need to have some other references ultimately than just that natural law itself, because just like you could raise the question of how does this have to do with same-sex matters, I have recently heard same-sex matters, same-sex attraction, same-sex marriage argued for on the basis of natural law. Now, many Christians would say, well, that's unthinkable. But my point is, I think, part of what you're saying. You can twist this in a variety of ways. You can twist natural law or the use of it.
Yeah, it seems like the Reformed tradition has long noted this. I'm struck. Francis Turretin speaks about it in his Institutes of Elenctic Theology, and brings up this possible objective, but he objection rather to it. And he says some people are saying, well, yes, but it's suppressed, therefore. And he says, well, look, it is there is suppression of the natural law. It doesn't mean it's eradicated, but there is genuine suppression of it. And what's interesting too is then Jerome Zanke, in his treatment on the natural law, goes to great lengths to spell out that he sees natural law as written unequally in various people. Now, again, this is in some ways outside my wheelhouse. It's not Ezekiel, so for our listeners, that's what I'm consumed with right now is Ezekiel. But nonetheless, to me, it at least shows this recognition that natural law isn't the silver bullet that sort of solves all these things. And so there's sources of explanation. Now, how do we deal with this?
Well, Calvin would throw in a big dose of common grace for even natural law to function in a non-Christian setting and even within a Christian setting. And as a grace, it's undeserved, and as a grace, as a common or general grace, it's likewise not as such equally distributed to all people, all places, all societies, all at the same time. It can be very diverse. In fact, we can come under God's wrath, in which, that's a Romans 1 theme again, in which God lets us sort of hang ourselves. But natural law in a Christian use can't get away from, say natural, fine, but the natural belongs to God too. And the natural testifies of God. The natural law is his law.
Right.
And natural law then gives us a God's eye view of morality. And as soon as, and I'm thinking of this, making a public appeal to natural law, as soon as a secular society hears and understands that you're making a God's eye view appeal to morality by natural law, their objections there are not going to be different than their objections to making appeal to special revelation or Holy Scripture.
That's right. And this has happened. I mean, sometimes people think, when you talk about the bullet or what Dr. Beach was just saying, to solve this, in other words, how do we break through, how do we as Christians stand up in the public square and have a witness? And a lot of people will say, well, it must be exclusively through natural law. It can never be through a mention or an appeal to Scripture. Well, I don't see any proper warrant for that assertion. I think it's just that. It's an assertion. And besides the which, it may assume that those that we would wish to speak to in the public sphere, if I may say, without putting too fine a point, are idiots. In other words, and I've seen this sort of thing happen, you stand up, a bill is in debate on the legislature, it's in discussion, and the Christian legislator stands up and he says, he starts to talk about the bill, and somewhere in the course of his debate, he supports the point by appealing, maybe even in a very offhanded fashion, to natural law. And then the debate goes to another person who opposes the bill and says, we all know that my distinguished friend who just spoke is a renowned Christian, and he mentioned natural law. Well, in fact, what he said was part of the 7th commandment of the 10 commandments, which we know he all believes. People know these things exist. They know there's a Bible. They know there's commandments, and they know that we believe these things.
When Clarence Thomas was being considered for the Supreme Court, he made an appeal to natural law as a good Roman Catholic, and people pounced on it.
That's right.
So if we think we've entered some sort of safe turf by appealing to natural law over against telling the Christian story in appealing to the Bible. Abraham Kuyper had a rather different take. He believed in natural law. He believed in special revelation. He believed in derivative Christian principles derived accordingly, and he liked to argue from principles that way. But he was also rather frank. Yeah, I bring my faith to the table. What do you bring? Unbelief. You bring your atheism to the table. You bring... you're thinking out of foundations, out of presuppositions. You're bringing a morality to the table. Here's mine. Where do you get yours? So, I think that's more effective than we allow it to be. We should let the power of the Christian story stand over against a naturalistic, evolutionistic, empty story, because there's a lot of empty, broken lives who suffer a lot of infidelity, betrayal, duplicity. And besides, the Christian vision given through natural law, enforced by common grace, and made explicit through special revelation, is a story that isn't hobby horsing on something. It has a way of talking about justice for all, a way of loving neighbor as self, a way of promoting justice and protecting neighbor. That's a Christian story that actually I think we underestimate, that the world might not actually be persuaded by it.
Right. And as you know, Kuyper both distinguished the church as institute and organism. He understood that distinction in terms of the church as church and the church as Christians, as well as he admired the American scene and the separation of church and state. He admired that, and he didn't believe in the church over the state, nor the state over the church. He believed that they both had their proper spheres. At the same time, while he would separate an institutional separation of church and state, while he would support that, he would not support what is impossible, the separation of faith from any area of life.
Right.
We bring our faith, while there may be institutional separation, we bring our faith into every area of life.
Where does unbelief separate its unbelief from the rest of life? They let their unbelief shape their marriage. They let their unbelief shape their politics. They let their unbelief shape their economics. They let their unbelief shape their science, their art, their recreation. They carry and bring their unbelief to all avenues of life. It's only Christians, or a certain kind of Christian, that huddles their faith in certain corners and then declares a non-Christ zone, not for Jesus zone, when in fact Colossians 1 tells us that all things are through him, by him, unto him, that all things are subject to him, that he has all authority on heaven and on earth, that he's Lord of lords, King of kings. He's not cordoned off somewhere. And it's quite unfortunate to use natural law as an area in which we'll make common appeal to the culture at large and leave Jesus in church, that is, at the worship service.
Right.
This is just not at all the biblical portrait, and it's not one we should follow in any way, shape, or form.
And someone, I think, who also got it right, to go back all the way to the ancient church.
I thought you were going to go all the way back to Charles Hodge.
Well, I will get to him at some point, but no, all the way back to Augustine. The city of God gets this so right in this sense. The emperor is converted in 312 and issues the Edict of Milan in 313. So now Christianity is legal. In 380, Theodosius I says not only is it legal, but everybody's got to be one. Everybody's got to believe this Christian faith. And then the empire is so, by Eusebius and others, right, identified. The Roman Empire and the Catholic Church are so identified that the success of one is the success of the other. So in 410, when Rome is sacked by the Huns, people are going, if the Roman Empire is coming to an end, is Christianity? And Augustine writes his Great City of God and says no, because they're not the same thing. Kingdoms come and kingdoms go. The church continues on. And so he makes the proper distinctions between city of this world and city of God. But he also very much talks about how those in the city of God, which he doesn't ever simply identify with the institutional church. He's very clear about this. The city of God is bigger than just the church as an institute. It's all of the people of God. But he's very clear that as they go out in the world, to take a line from what I wrote about Hodge, he's very concerned, and we should be very concerned with how, as church, we distinguish ourselves from the world. That's on the one hand. But on the other hand, how we give ourselves to the world. And we don't want a use of either natural law or two kingdoms that walls the church off from the world. So it's sort of let the world have its way. And if I may just say so without being offensive, let the world go to hell. But the church has something that the world needs, and the church needs to bring it to the world. I mean, think about the parable of the Good Samaritan. I mean, we have something, we ought to be binding up the wounds. And I think this is what you were talking about a minute ago. We have something that in no small sense is the most attractive thing you can have if you rightly understand it. We have life, we have light, we have hope. And so we want to think about
we have gospel.
We have gospel. How do we distinguish ourselves from the world, right? So that church minds its proper spiritual business, that church doesn't try to be the state, that church doesn't politicize in a misguided way, but on the other hand, that doesn't render us in a walled-off ghetto. And we're not concerned about giving ourselves to the world. Because if we're supposed to imitate Jesus Christ, he gave himself to the world. And we as his followers need to give ourselves to the world. And so that means we need to be distinct. We need to understand our call. But our call is not to just be Christians on Sunday morning and read the Bible there, and then the rest of the time just go out with the world and
just be a natural law moral guy.
Yes.
Be a moral guy.
Wow, lots there packed into part 2 of our natural law conversation. We'll finish off with part 3 next time here on Roundtable. You can get a sense of the limits of natural law as an appeal to get everyone on the same page morally. So the obvious question then is, well, we have the Bible. Can't we use it to enact all of our laws? Our faculty respond to this question and more next time here on Roundtable.